At exactly 7:03 a.m., the front gate of my ranch rattled so hard it sounded like someone was trying to break in. I was brushing down Tango, one of our gentlest patrol horses, when the sound of screeching tires made him twitch. Before I could even call out, I heard it, Karen's voice, shrill as a broken whistle, tearing through the morning silence like a chainsaw stuck in reverse. She was already marching up the gravel driveway in her bathrobe, flip-flops slapping, wielding a coffee cup like it was a weapon. Behind her trailed two bewildered animal control officers, clearly unsure why they'd been called to a peaceful rural property where the only crime committed was a horse daring to sneeze too loudly during Karen's backyard yoga. As I walked toward them, still holding a curry comb, she screamed, "There they are, the dangerous beasts I've been telling you about. They're loud. They're unsanitary. They poop in public view. Shut them down. Arrest the owner." The younger officer blinked twice and tilted his head like a confused dog. But the real moment that set the tone for everything that followed came seconds later when a cloud of dust approached from the west pasture. Every head turned as Sheriff Briggs rode up the trail, in full uniform, hat straight, badge gleaming, and mounted on none other than Dusty, the same horse Karen had just called in as a public nuisance. He stopped right in front of her, dismounted with the kind of authority that could silence a room, and casually said, "Morning, ma'am, I hear you've got a problem with one of my deputies." Karen's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Then she called 911 on him. That was the moment I knew things were about to get wild. You'd think that moment would humble her, but no. Karen had this look, like she couldn't process the fact that a horse could hold a badge. She stood there, blinking, trying to speak but stuck between indignation and utter disbelief. One of the animal control officers gently gestured to Dusty's saddle where the laminated patrol unit ID was clipped, and said, "Ma'am, this horse is part of the sheriff's mounted division. He's technically your neighborhood patrol officer." Karen screeched in a pitch I didn't know humans could hit. "That's not a thing. Horses can't be cop. I want to speak to the human one in charge." I raised my hand casually and said that'd be me. "I'm the handler, trainer, and field coordinator for the mounted units in this district." She looked like I'd just told her I invented horses. "This is a residential zone. You can't have livestock here. That's against HOA rules." Sheriff Briggs cleared his throat and leaned against Dusty with the kind of calm that said he'd dealt with about 36 Karens in his lifetime. "Actually, this isn't just a residence. This is a certified operational site for mounted patrol. It was grandfathered in long before the HOA charter even existed." Karen, of course, refused to believe this. She demanded documentation. She demanded the horses be removed immediately. And most hilariously, she demanded that Dusty apologize for pooping near her mailbox. By now a few neighbors had peeked out of their houses or drifted down the road to see what the commotion was. Someone started filming. The second animal control officer, an older gentleman with a thick gray mustache, calmly said, "Ma'am, unless there's evidence of neglect or abuse, we don't have jurisdiction here. These horses are clearly healthy, registered, and apparently wearing law enforcement IDs." Karen lost it. She screamed that she'd seen Tango laughing at her during her downward dog, that the horses neigh at night just to spite her, that the smell of hay triggered her allergies and her emotional stability. I tried not to laugh, but I failed. Briggs didn't even hide his smirk. Karen called the police again, and this time she told dispatch she was being harassed by a rogue cowboy militia. I wish I were joking. When dispatch informed her that the officer she was reporting was, in fact, already on scene and was the sheriff, she accused everyone of covering up a horse conspiracy. I started wondering what kind of books she reads. At that point, I offered coffee to the animal control officers, who were trying desperately not to laugh. They declined but lingered, maybe out of morbid curiosity to see how much deeper Karen would dig her own hole. Then came the moment when Karen stormed off toward the gate, only to trip on a rock, spill coffee down her robe, and fling her phone into a horse trough. Tango, sweet boy that he is, nuzzled her shoulder in concern. She shrieked as if he'd bitten her. "Don't touch me with your hooves of crime," she yelled, slipping on the wet grass and falling again. Now she was wet, stained, screaming, and unintentionally baptizing herself in her own humiliation. Meanwhile, someone from the crowd yelled "World Star" and the phones were officially rolling. After she fled back toward her house, Briggs turned to me and muttered, "I've seen meth raids go smoother." I asked him what the next step was and he said, "We'll be filing a formal report, and I'll personally notify the HOA board about the misuse of emergency services. But don't be surprised if she escalates." I nodded. I knew Karen. She wasn't the type to back down. She was the type who doubled down even when she'd already bet the whole table. Sure enough, later that day I got a notice from the HOA citing me for improper fencing, unapproved barn modifications, and livestock violation codes, all of which had been cleared years ago through county permit. It was clearly Karen using her position on the HOA board to try and get around the legal system that had just smacked her down. What she didn't know was that every single document I had, permits, patrol certifications, historical land use exemptions, were already digitized and backed up across multiple drives. I sent them all, with time-stamped confirmation, to the HOA's legal contact. And I copied the sheriff's office, just for good measure. But I wasn't done. That night, I rechecked every camera angle on the property. Our mounted patrol system wasn't just ceremonial. We trained for real emergencies. Search and rescue, missing persons, even disaster response drills. And every saddle was equipped with body cam footage for transparency. The footage of Karen accusing a patrol horse of intimidation was gold. The sheriff told me the next morning that a couple of the deputies had already made memes out of her 911 call. My favorite one had her face mid-scream with the caption, "Who let the horses out?" That might have been the end of it. But Karen wasn't finished. No, she was plotting. And I could feel it. There was something in her eyes that morning, not just rage or embarrassment. Something more calculated. She wanted the horses gone. Not just punished. She wanted them erased. And that meant this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The sheriff agreed and said he'd be back to do a surprise patrol visit the next week. I thanked him, fed Dusty a carrot, and watched as they rode off down the path, badge gleaming in the morning light. The last thing I heard before going inside was Karen slamming her door so hard her wind chimes fell off the hook. And I knew we were just getting started. The very next morning, my inbox pinged with an email from the HOA marked urgent. The subject line was a hilariously dramatic livestock threat to community order. I clicked it open while pouring oats into Dusty's trough, already expecting nonsense. Sure enough, Karen had written a full report accusing me of harboring aggressive animals, endangering neighborhood peace, and, my personal favorite, training horses to psychologically intimidate residents through synchronized stomping. She attached blurry screenshots from her home security camera showing my horses walking in a straight line, which she called a hostile formation. I laughed so hard I dropped the feed bucket. The horses looked more like they were on a Sunday stroll than preparing for an invasion. But it wasn't just a rant. Attached to the email was a notice summoning me to a so-called emergency HOA board meeting to address complaints and violations. It was clear Karen wasn't giving up after her disaster with animal control and the sheriff. No, now she was trying to weaponize the HOA to force me and the horses out. I knew this game. She'd stack the board, flood it with her buddies, and try to pass a new rule under the guise of safety. What she didn't count on was that I'd been through this rodeo before, and I came armed with paperwork, legal precedent, and a stack of video evidence that would make her choke on her gluten-free muffins. That evening, the community center was packed. Karen had rallied every HOA board member she could bribe with cheese platters, and they sat at the front table like they were about to host a courtroom drama. I walked in wearing jeans, boots, and a crisp blue patrol polo with the mounted unit logo. I could see her flinch. She stood up immediately and launched into a fiery speech, complete with hand gestures and printed poster board. She claimed the horses were creating noise pollution, causing allergic reactions, blocking property lines, and contributing to animal-related microaggressions. She even cited an incident where a neighbor sneezed while walking by the barn as proof of harm. Then she pulled out a new move. She proposed a vote to limit the presence of non-domesticated animals on HOA property. She added a clause that excluded cats, dogs, and birds but intentionally left out equines. It was a calculated strike. The other board members looked unsure. A few shifted in their chairs. One whispered to another. That's when I stepped forward and calmly asked to respond. Karen tried to interrupt, but one of the older board members, Mr. Gilmore, hushed her and gave me the floor. I explained that the horses were not only domesticated and trained, but were certified law enforcement unit. I handed out documentation to every board member, including the original zoning exemptions for patrol animals and the state law allowing operational animals to reside on active duty premises, regardless of HOA restrictions. The real kicker came when I played a short clip from the body cam footage. It showed Karen screaming at Dusty, calling him a war criminal, and threatening to sue the county. The room erupted into quiet snickers. Even the board members couldn't keep a straight face. Mr. Gilmore looked at Karen and said, "I'm sorry, are you suggesting we evict law enforcement animals based on personal feelings?" Karen turned redder than a beet. She hissed that it was about neighborhood safety and emotional harm. I responded by handing over veterinary reports, noise studies, and neighbor testimonials, all confirming the horses were healthy, quiet, and well-loved. The vote failed. Badly. Only Karen and one other woman, who turned out to be her cousin, voted in favor. The rest declined, and 2 outright laughed when casting their vote. Karen stormed out before the meeting even ended, slamming her binder shut like it was a courtroom gavel. But she wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to find the gate to the western pasture locked with a brand new padlock. One I hadn't installed. I checked the security feed. There she was, just after midnight, sneaking onto the property in a hoodie, fumbling with bolt cutters and a chain, then locking the gate shut and skipping away like a gremlin. I could have called the sheriff then and there. Instead, I decided to play it smarter. I took screenshots from the footage, printed them, and left a copy in her mailbox with a handwritten note that read "Smile" for the camera. No threats, no confrontation. Just facts. That same day, a deputy from the sheriff's office showed up for routine patrol on Tango. The sight of the horse trotting past Karen's house nearly sent her into orbit. She stepped outside and screamed something about restraining orders and illegal surveillance. The deputy tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, this is a patrol route. Please return inside." Later that week, Karen escalated. She submitted an anonymous complaint, poorly masked as it quoted her exact phrasing, to county zoning claiming I had built illegal structures on my land, that I had unauthorized fencing, a barn expansion, and a trench that was a safety hazard. What she didn't know was that the trench wasn't mine. It was hers. See, I'd caught her digging on the far edge of the property weeks ago. I hadn't thought much of it then, assuming it was some garden project. But now I remembered, and I had the footage. So I sent it. I sent it to the zoning office, with timestamps, property boundary data, and a lovely voiceover clip of Karen saying I'll dig whatever I want. This is community land. No one owns dirt. The response from the county was swift. They not only threw out her complaint, but opened an investigation into unauthorized excavation on protected patrol land. Karen had accidentally triggered a land use violation against herself. And that's when the sheriff called me. He said things were heating up fast. That her actions weren't just annoying anymore, they were borderline criminal. Interfering with operational law enforcement units carried penalties. If she kept escalating, she could be looking at charges. I asked if I should press them. He said not yet. Let her bury herself deeper. And oh, she would. Because the next morning, the horse's water supply stopped flowing. The pump was fine. The well was fine. But the valve was shut. Not just shut, but cranked down with a wrench and sealed with glue. Someone had tampered with the main line. I filed the report immediately and gave the sheriff access to the security logs. Within hours, a deputy reviewed the footage and confirmed it. Karen had done it. Wearing gloves, in the middle of the night, she'd snuck onto the property and sabotaged the water line to the patrol horses. That crossed a line. It wasn't just HOA drama anymore. It was animal endangerment. Tampering with critical infrastructure. The sheriff told me to hold tight. They were building a case. But he assured me this was going to get serious, and soon. Meanwhile, I set up a temporary water system with backup tanks and monitored everything through motion-activated alert. Karen had no idea that the more she meddled, the more airtight the case against her became. I knew it was only a matter of time before she'd try something else. But even I wasn't prepared for what she did next. Because in her desperation to win, Karen was about to cross a line even she couldn't walk back from. And when it happened, the fallout wouldn't just hit her, it would shake the entire HOA to its core. The following Monday started like any other. Morning chores, feeding the horses, checking the fence lines, refilling water tanks, making sure all saddle gear was ready for the weekly drills. But something felt off. Tango was tense. Dusty kept pacing the pasture edge. Even Blaze, our most relaxed gelding, had his ears pinned back toward the south trail. When I walked the fence line, I found why. A bright yellow construction marker was staked right through my boundary sign. Fresh tracks from heavy machinery, something with treads, cut through the grass where the sheriff's patrol path ran. That was not just a violation of HOA courtesy. That was sabotage. I followed the tracks down to the lower pasture and found something I didn't expect. A bulldozer parked in the brush. It had no crew, no warning cones, and worst of all, it was angled toward the side of my barn. A few more feet and it would have crushed the feed room. I called the sheriff immediately. While waiting, I inspected the area around the dozer. Something shiny caught my eye wedged under the blade, a chunk of plastic, scorched on one side. I pulled it out and froze. It was part of a training dummy we use in mounted patrol rescue scenarios. The bulldozer had driven right over it. The whole training setup had been destroyed. And that meant someone had intentionally driven through our designated law enforcement zone. It wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Sheriff Briggs arrived not long after, red in the face and jaw tight. He looked at the tire marks, at the damage, then at the destroyed dummy, and didn't say a word for a long moment. Then he muttered something under his breath and said we need to get county officials here now. While he made the calls, I spotted a black car slowing near the main road. Karen. She was watching from behind the wheel, sunglasses perched high like she thought she was in a spy movie. I walked toward her, but she rolled up the window and drove off. No words. No confrontation. Just that smug little half-smile that said she thought she'd won. She had no idea what she'd just stepped into. Within the hour, a county code inspector arrived. He checked the bulldozer plates and confirmed they were linked to a contractor hired through a third-party landscaping firm, one known for working HOA development projects. The kicker? The request for land grading had been submitted by someone claiming to act on behalf of the HOA, using a name remarkably similar to Karen's maiden name. They'd even forged digital documents to make it look official. The inspector took photos, made notes, and said it would likely trigger a legal investigation. As if that weren't enough, the deputy who had accompanied him went to check the area near the pasture trench. He paused, then motioned me over. He'd found something buried just beneath the surface, a length of PVC pipe, cut and redirected, leading into a side channel I didn't recognize. It wasn't mine. We followed the pipe across the property line, straight into the rear corner of Karen's backyard. She had diverted runoff from my patrol land into her private garden. Not only had she tampered with the water lines last week, but now we had proof she'd rerouted groundwater from government-allocated land into her own use. It was layered and insane. But she didn't stop there. That night, the barn alarm went off. I rushed down with my flashlight, thinking maybe a raccoon or a broken latch. Instead, I found the side door wide open, the lights flickering, and gear scattered across the floor. Saddle pads were slashed. Water buckets overturned. A bag of feed had been poured into the hay pile, contaminating it. And worst of all, the far stall door was damaged. Someone had tried to remove one of the horses. Tango's stall. The latch had been bent as if someone had forced it with a crowbar but got scared off. I checked the footage, heart racing. There she was, clear as day. Karen in a dark hoodie and gardening gloves, creeping around the barn with a flashlight. She tried to lure Tango out with carrot. When he didn't budge, she kicked the stall, poured the feed, and stormed out. That was it. No more waiting. No more letting her hang herself slowly. The sheriff came back the next morning with a full warrant team and animal welfare officers in tow. They filed the formal charges: trespassing, property damage, tampering with emergency patrol animals, and illegal water diversion. Karen was served a cease and desist and told to remain off my property indefinitely. When she was approached at her home, she pretended not to know what they were talking about. She denied everything, claimed the footage was AI generated, and that the horses were just actors in a scheme to take her house. No one was buying it. But what came next surprised even me. As part of the investigation, the sheriff's team scanned the area around the barn with ground-penetrating radar to ensure no more tampering had occurred. What they found was something none of us expected. A hidden tunnel, partially collapsed, running from the outer pasture edge directly under the training field and toward Karen's property line. Not a huge one, just wide enough to crawl through, and filled with discarded gloves, old tools, and empty energy drink cans. She had been sneaking in and out like some cartoon villain. We were speechless. The county called in an environmental safety team to check for structural damage and erosion, and they confirmed the tunnel had been slowly undermining the corner of my barn foundation. If left undiscovered, the barn could have collapsed under the horse's weight in a few months. The seriousness of the charges doubled. Karen was not only facing criminal charges now, but also civil liability for endangered animals, damage to state property, and environmental violations. When she was notified, she went silent. No yelling. No calls. Just silence. Until 2 days later, when she made her next move. She walked into the sheriff's station, completely uninvited, and demanded to speak to whoever is still alive after this cowboy circus. The front desk deputy politely told her she was not allowed to be there due to the ongoing investigation. She responded by flinging a stack of papers across the counter and saying, "I'm filing for a court injunction. You can't legally keep horses this close to residential structures. This is a health hazard and I've got asthma." The sheriff walked out of his office just in time to hear that and asked what, specifically, she hoped the injunction would achieve. She said she wanted all patrol animals removed within 48 hours or she would go public. That phrase, go public, was the beginning of her final collapse. Because the very next day she held a press conference. That's right. Karen called the local news, set up a podium in her front yard, and gave an unhinged speech about how she was being targeted by law enforcement livestock. She made accusations of psychological warfare, accused me of horse-based surveillance, and insisted her garden had been poisoned by rogue deputies. What she didn't know was that the sheriff had already shared the footage and tunnel evidence with the news station. They aired a split-screen broadcast showing her ranting on one side and her crawling through a dirt tunnel in the middle of the night on the other. It went viral, hard. Within hours she was trending online. People dubbed her Tunnel Karen. Memes exploded. One showed her riding a goat with a caption that read, "Watch out boys, she's coming for your barn." But the humiliation didn't stop there. That night, someone organized a peaceful protest on horseback. Dozens of people rode through the neighborhood, dressed in cowboy gear, singing parody songs about HOA drama. The parade passed right by her house, and she watched, seething, from behind her curtains. Her power was crumbling. The law had caught up. The community was laughing. and her carefully crafted image was unraveling faster than her trenchcoat in a dust storm. But even then, even in defeat, Karen had one more card to play. One more outrageous stunt to try and regain control. And what she did next would test every ounce of patience I had left. 3 days passed without a single outburst from Karen, and in our world, that was more suspicious than any screaming fit. After her viral meltdown and the now infamous tunnel discovery, she vanished from public view. No HOA emails, no bizarre accusations, not even her usual early morning tirades during patrol rounds. For a moment, I let myself believe maybe, just maybe, the universe had finally humbled her. But silence, as it turns out, wasn't surrender. It was planning. And when Karen returned, she brought a storm of chaos that not even the sheriff saw coming. It began with an email from the local news station. A junior producer reached out to ask if I wanted to respond to Karen's exclusive interview, which was scheduled to air that evening. I didn't even know she'd agreed to another camera. I tuned in, unsure whether to brace for slander or slapstick. What I saw defied both. She was seated in her living room, surrounded by fake candles and a shrine of her gardening awards, dressed in a shawl like she was a war widow. The reporter asked her to explain her side of the horse patrol controversy, and Karen launched into a bizarre narrative. She claimed she had been the victim of a coordinated campaign by rogue equestrians to mentally destabilize her. That horses had eyeballed her, that neighs were actually coded messages, and that her house was surrounded by hoof prints in precise patterns which, she insisted, resembled ancient warning symbols. By the end of the segment, the reporter looked visibly confused, and the clip abruptly cut off with Karen staring straight into the camera and whispering "justice for the grass." That phrase alone sparked an avalanche of internet mockery. Hashtags like #justice for the grass and #tunnel Karen trended overnight. TikTok creators reenacted her speech with their pet. Someone even did a remix with horses neighing in sync to her words. She became a meme not just locally, but nationally. The pressure should have pushed her into retreat. Instead, it lit a fire under her delusions. The next morning, the sheriff called me and asked if I'd seen the viral video where Karen claimed to have hacked into the patrol horses' command system. I had. It was a 10-minute rant posted on a fringe forum where she held up what looked like a TV remote and claimed she could send signals through a nearby cell tower to manipulate my horse's movements. She then proceeded to wave the remote and demand the horses perform a formation. They stood still. Blaze yawned. Tango scratched his flank against a post. Karen then screamed that they were resisting orders and demanded the mayor intervene. The sheriff was laughing so hard on the phone, he had to hand it off to a deputy to finish reading the report. But things turned more serious when Karen tried to retaliate in the only way she had left, dragging children into it. That afternoon, during a community safety event that the mounted patrol team was hosting for local families, Karen called 911 again. She claimed that a child had been brainwashed by the horses and was attempting to ride them without permission as part of a cult ritual. It was one of the most outrageous accusations yet. The event was being held in the open field next to the stables, fully permitted, with multiple deputies and parent volunteers present. Dozens of witnesses saw what really happened. A young boy named Micah had gently patted Tango on the nose and asked if horses had birthdays. That was it. No riding. No rituals. Just pure, innocent curiosity. When officers arrived in response to her call, they found her shouting at a group of children and trying to take their parents' names to file witness statements. A deputy stepped in immediately, separating her from the families and issuing a formal warning. One of the other parents filmed the incident, and that footage hit the internet faster than wildfire. This time it was different. People weren't just laughing, they were furious. Threatening a child's safety, weaponizing emergency resources against a community event, trying to paint innocent behavior as criminal. Karen had crossed a line that the community wouldn't forgive. That night, the HOA held an emergency vote. This wasn't about patrol horses anymore. It was about the reputation and safety of the neighborhood. Residents gathered in record numbers at the community hall. One after another, they voiced their disgust, not just at Karen's latest stunt, but at the months of abuse, manipulation, and disruption she'd caused. Videos were played. Statements were read aloud. Even former allies of Karen stood up to say they'd had enough. When it came time to vote on her removal from the HOA board, the tally was swift and brutal. 94% in favor. Karen wasn't just removed as president, she was banned from holding any HOA position for 10 years. The motion passed with thunderous applause. But Karen didn't go quietly. The next morning, she chained herself to her mailbox and refused to leave. She held up a poster reading HOA coup in progress and shouted into a megaphone that she was a political prisoner. Within 20 minutes, deputies were called. Again. They tried calmly to get her to unchain herself, but she refused, crying that her house was under siege by hoofed insurgents. When they eventually removed her from the scene, gently, with more patience than she deserved, someone from the crowd whispered that she'd finally lost the last marble she was clinging to. For a while, it seemed like the neighborhood could breathe again. The patrols resumed their routes without interference. The sheriff expanded the mounted division's outreach effort. Children came by regularly to feed the horses carrots and listen to safety talk. The atmosphere shifted. But then came the lawsuit. Karen, somehow still clinging to her fantasy of revenge, filed a civil suit claiming emotional distress, property devaluation, and psychic trauma caused by the horses' staring problem. Her lawsuit included photos of hoof prints near her sidewalk, which she claimed were an invasion of personal space. She included the viral memes as evidence of character assassination, conveniently ignoring the fact that most had originated from her own videos. Her legal team, if you could call it that, was a one-man operation run by her brother-in-law who ran a mobile notary business and had once been banned from courtroom appearances for yelling objections during traffic court. The case was scheduled to be heard at the County Fairgrounds Courthouse, a fittingly public location during the week of the Regional Horse Expo. When Karen arrived for the first hearing, she wore a neck brace and sunglasses, despite having no injuries, and claimed she needed emotional support citrus fruit, holding a lemon like it was a therapy pet. The judge, an old rancher's son with zero tolerance for foolishness, asked her flatly if she had any medical or psychological documentation to support her claim. She handed over a folder of self-typed notes with phrases like, "The horses whispered secrets," "The grass no longer respects me," and "Hooves echo in my dreams." The courtroom fell into an eerie silence before the judge politely asked her to sit down and advised her to consider withdrawing the case. Still she refused. She insisted on pushing forward. The sheriff arrived midway through the session, seated tall on Dusty, who wore his full patrol gear, including his badge. Karen's scream echoed through the open-air arena. Not him. Not the poop one. The judge leaned forward, nodded to the bailiff, and said, "I believe we're done here." The case was dismissed. Karen was fined for wasting judicial resources and hit with a no-contact order regarding me, my animals, or any sheriff's department unit. As she was escorted out, she flung her lemon at Dusty and missed by 10 feet. The horse didn't flinch. He blinked once, then slowly turned his head away in what looked like the perfect gesture of dignified disinterest. By the end of the day, word had spread. Karen had lost every battle she tried to fight. She'd been mocked, banned, exposed, and legally shut down. But she wasn't done, not yet. Because the next thing she did would push the final boundary, one that no one in their right mind would dare touch. She was about to break into a space not even the HOA had jurisdiction over. And when she did, the fallout would not just land her in hot water. It would trigger a chain reaction that brought the entire county down on her doorstep. It was just before dawn when I got the call. The emergency alert system triggered on my phone with a motion sensor breach in the restricted training corral, a section of the property used exclusively for law enforcement drills. The horses weren't there overnight, thankfully, but the area was clearly marked with federal signage, fencing, and surveillance warnings. Whoever crossed that line wasn't just trespassing, they were breaching an active law enforcement site. I threw on my boots and jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out, already half knowing who I'd find. And there she was, Karen, crouched low behind one of the obstacle barrels, dressed head to toe in black athletic gear like she thought she was on a covert military op. She didn't even flinch when my flashlight beam hit her. She just looked up, defiant, and said in a calm, disturbing tone, "I'm gathering evidence. The horses are hiding something." My heart dropped, not out of fear, but because I realized this woman was long past caring about consequences. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed again. Sheriff Briggs was already on his way. The motion system wasn't just linked to my phone anymore. It now went directly to the sheriff's command post after the last sabotage incident. When I told Karen she was about to be arrested for entering a federally protected zone, she shrugged and said, "I'm not afraid. They've already made me a villain. Might as well be a martyr." Then she started walking toward the patrol stable with something in her hand. I couldn't see clearly in the dark, but it looked like a canister of some kind. I told her to stop, stay exactly where she was. She didn't. That's when I pulled out my whistle, the one we use during emergencies, and blew it 3 sharp times. Within seconds, 3 patrol horses came galloping down from the upper paddock, trained to respond to that exact signal. Karen froze, startled by the thunder of hooves. Blaze positioned himself between her and the barn entrance, while Tango and Dusty flanked my left side. They weren't threatening, but their presence was unmistakable. Karen stumbled backward, tripping over a tire and dropping the canister, which rolled across the gravel and came to a stop at my feet. It wasn't what I expected. It was a can of bright neon spray paint. She had come to tag the patrol barn with a giant message, like some angry teenager trying to graffiti her feelings onto a government facility. Her plan was absurd, petty, and illegal all at once. Sheriff Briggs arrived not 5 minutes later, cruiser lights flashing across the pasture like lightning. He stepped out calmly, took one look at Karen, then looked at me, then at the can of paint on the ground. He didn't even ask for an explanation. He just said, "Put her in the back." One of his deputies cuffed her without resistance. She didn't argue. She just kept mumbling something under her breath about exposing secrets, uncovering the truth, and taking down the horse regime. If it wasn't so dangerous, it would have been comedic. But trespassing on a federal training site was no laughing matter. That meant felony charges, especially when the intent included vandalism. The sheriff turned to me and said she just bought herself a one-way ticket to a court date with the feds. News traveled fast. Before lunchtime, the footage from the barn's security system had already leaked online. People were in disbelief. Not just at what she did, but how far she'd spiraled. One clip showed her talking to herself in the dark, pointing at hoof prints and whispering things like, "See, they're watching." That same clip ended up as the intro to a late-night show monologue that night. The nation laughed, but the neighborhood didn't. We were done laughing. Karen's behavior had crossed every imaginable line. She had sabotaged equipment, threatened public safety events, harassed children, defamed law enforcement, and now trespassed on restricted land. The HOA board, now entirely free of her influence, issued a unanimous declaration banning her from attending any future community meetings, gatherings, or events of any kind. Her property, once the pristine centerpiece of her self-righteous crusade, fell into disrepair. Weeds took over the flower bed. Her once immaculate hedges grew wild. And the strangest part, she didn't seem to care. She stopped mowing her lawn, stopped responding to mail, and eventually stopped answering her door altogether. It was like she had retreated from reality completely. But the justice system hadn't forgotten. Her court date arrived within weeks. Held at the county seat, the trial was expected to be routine, until it wasn't. Karen showed up in a velvet blazer, hair curled into tight ringlets, holding a binder labeled Operation Horse Truth. She requested to represent herself again, despite every judge in the district already knowing her antics. When questioned about the events at the patrol barn, she claimed she was on a reconnaissance mission to uncover classified animal experiments. She suggested the sheriff's department was using horses to store illegal surveillance equipment and that I, somehow, was in on it. The courtroom was silent, stunned by the sheer absurdity. But then came the moment that made jaws drop. She called her first witness, herself. That's right. She stood up, stepped into the witness box, and began interviewing herself in the third person. The judge interrupted and asked if she was aware this was not legally permissible. She responded by quoting a random television show and claiming she had precedent. At that point, the judge had seen enough. He issued an immediate psychological evaluation request, citing erratic behavior, delusional speech, and concern for competency. Karen was escorted from the courtroom, still shouting phrases like equestrian espionage and saddle subterfuge. The evaluation determined she needed mental health intervention and would not stand trial until cleared by a medical professional. Her charges weren't dropped, but placed on hold pending review. The court gave her 60 days to comply. She didn't. Instead, she doubled down online, creating a blog from her home claiming she was under house arrest by a horse-led militia. She posted daily updates, complete with conspiracy diagrams and blurry photos of patrol horses from 50 feet away. The blog became infamous, mostly because people thought it was satire. But it wasn't. Karen was serious. And now, finally isolated. With her presence fading into irrelevance, peace returned to the neighborhood. The horses resumed patrol drills without incident. Parents felt safe bringing their kids by. The sheriff launched a new volunteer program for mounted outreach, and the HOA, now unified and no longer under tyrannical rule, began rebuilding the fractured sense of community. As for me, I focused on training a new colt named Valor, who showed promise as our next top patrol horse. Life moved on. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the pasture glowed with soft golden light, Sheriff Briggs joined me at the fence line, sipping coffee. We watched Dusty and Tango playfully spar in the distance, while Blaze stood stoic near the gate like he always did. The sheriff chuckled and said, "Remember when she tried to sue a horse for intimidation?" I nodded, smiling. And when she claimed the barn was haunted by Civil War ghosts recruited by law enforcement. He nearly spit out his coffee laughing. We stood there in silence for a while after that.